So I'm quite sick. Therefore I have made a best of my elf content from my other channel. If you like to see more, please check out the link to my other channel in the video description. And now enjoy some elves while I'm getting better. Dark wood and high elves are a staple in most fantasy stories, games and movies, but they are just essentially different in their lifestyle because of their subspecies, and most of it is unchangeable. But how about the rise of just one single elf species that merely inhabits different nations with completely different ideas and ideologies? What once was a united nation became perhaps increasingly changed and very different from the original ideas that once united the elf nation at its founding, turning what normally would have been a subspecies with different skin colors into just political ideologies. And this would also mean that they can change, which not only means that evil races have now a way of being redeemed, but also that the different sides doesn't have to be very static and unchangeable, which would normally limit the kind of story one can tell, and particularly in games, the amount of freedom and different characters one could experience. For example, if you play as a dark elf, you don't have to necessarily play as a genocidal maniac. If you play as a high elf, you now don't have to be extremely arrogant to your friends and foes alike. And if you play as a wood elf, you don't necessarily have to consume all the mushrooms and different herbal medicines that your society values so much. So again, political ideologies would be way cooler in this way, or perhaps have different elf species. So again, political ideologies would be way cooler in this way, or perhaps you could have different elf species in the story, aka what you normally would call wood elves, snow elves, high elves, and so on and so forth, but that are now living in different states, that then become known as dark, high or wood elves. But all of them are living in all of the different elf states, because they are not united by ethnicity, but by ideology. That way you could have as many elf species with as many exotic powers as you want, but still maintain the basic conflict and the openness of all of it. For example, wood elves could simply be a term for all the different elf species that are very, very conservative, who shun buildings out of wood and stone and other dead materials, and fashion their homes from trees, plants, gigantic flowers, or even meat-eating plants that devour their dead, since they are having the deeply held belief all life should not live with, but also in nature. The high elves could be inventing gigantic cities made out of marble, overgrown with fruit-bearing plants, elven artisans, and their little trinkets could make this nation rich. Trade is what they excel on, their spells being honed not to control plants but animals, which are then used as labor, something that the wood elves would abhor. And then there are the dark elves, named after the fumes of their furnaces. They have greatly militarized their society into basically one big stratocracy. But the citizens themselves want it this way. They demand the destruction of the forests for fuel. They are fine if most of the water is now polluted, most of the animals are laboring in abhorrent conditions, while the more powerful ones are domesticated as beasts of war and bred for loyalty, strength and resilience. They are also fine with mandatory conscription that lasts decades, and the fires of industries are now burning everything what it once meant to be an elf, in order to save themselves from the humans who arrived at this continent less than 300 years ago, but who are about to overrun the entire place, not by being better mages or fighters, or by being richer, or by being smarter, but by their sheer weight of numbers. And we also have a close analog for this explosive population increase humans are capable of. For example, when German settlers came to Brazil, they founded the city of Blumenau, where even today the second biggest Oktoberfest of the entire world is held. And they had, at least initially, a birth rate of around 10 kids per woman. Yes, 10, not 1.0, 10 kids per woman. But, and here's the thing, the humans are just as divided as the elves, and perhaps they will be not fought any war, but succumb to their own infighting, while the elves could just have watched from the sidelines, making the high elves to a lesser and the dark elves to a greater extent very, very bad looking. Or maybe the humans come partially under the dominion of the dark elves and now have to free themselves from their oppressors. There are so many possibilities now. Thanks to removing the characters, the moral view, and so on and so forth from some species. You could still have very different types of elves with vastly different abilities, but without every single member of every single species having a certain personality and unchangeable moral views and ambitions. Hello and welcome to another episode of Fantasy World Building. And today we are going to take a look at literally the most important aspect of any fictional, somewhat medieval fantasy world, for it sells more copies than the entirety of Steam. The one, the only, the booby armor. Now, if boob armor is a must-have in a realistic fantasy world, grounded in the adamant logic and rules that the world has been meticulously built upon, which it very well is in most fantasy universes anyway, then boob armor needs at least a real convincing reason for why it exists. Aside from just selling books, games and movies. And speaking of games, while in more arcadey games like Monster Hunter, the boob armor is just a normal armor compared to the rest of the armor, and also available for men, it still requires more explanation than just saying, well, this woman needs to breathe to her skin, in order to properly explain it. In basically any setting that takes itself very serious, like a Song of Ice and Fire, or the first 4 to 6 seasons of Game of Thrones. I mean, boob armor there would stick out like a rusty nail among any stair railing, or rather the thing it will inevitably bury itself into. So let's take a look at how we could combine the wish of any marketing and sales team with the inner logic of any fantasy world. Boob armor could be a sign of status and skill, something not necessarily worn when the nation or the entire fate of the world is at stake, but maybe in lesser conflicts, where some more flexibility and wiggle room still exists, because it takes an enormous amount of both to run around half naked and not get cut into pieces at the very generous midriff section. The wearer could also make a statement that basically temperature, no matter if it's too hot or too cold, is a non-issue. It could also be used in gladiatorial battles, because at one point in time, the excitement of a potentially deadly duel between two highly skilled opponents simply isn't enough to entertain the onlookers. I mean, the Romans also limited the armor that their specific gladiators could wear. But this doesn't mean that suddenly having two female elves fight with their hands tied behind or even between their backs in a large pool of ankle-high oil might be flat out necessary or appreciated. And speaking of flat out necessary, if elves, for example, which are generally portrayed as very slender, have two big arguments, this could be seen as a sign of status, as a fashion trend. So focusing on that could be a part of culture. I mean, the very concept of displaying boobies could also deeply penetrate elfish culture, since they live far longer than humans, but are always depicted as very few in numbers, and therefore their birth rate would be abysmal. So maybe displaying assets of reproduction is also a sign of status and wealth and virility. I mean, if you want to get really silly, boob armor could also even be turned into a religion, and the word boob into something sacred, because it represents a certain outlook on them, namely front view, side view and top view. So basically the dodgier the clothing choices, the dodgier the elves and the setting should be, and the higher the status of fertility should be in the society of a more serious setting. And this could also be used to craft a truly alien elfish culture, or at least explain why vanilla elven culture is the way it is. For example, the reason for why they adore plants is because they are seen as something that grows, thrives, and occasionally throbs. It is a sign of life, virility and fertility, as something plentiful to be aspired to. I mean, taking the seed of another over and over again and spreading it around an entire countryside is basically just a very glamorous description of farming. I mean, elves are oftentimes depicted as being able to talk to, or at least to be in tune with nature, and therefore they would surely notice that all of the beautiful bird songs are just the verbal equivalent to unsolicited dick pics. And maybe all of this could be used to explain for why, despite so few elves exist, so many half-elves can be found in the world of Hentalia or something like this. And of course, since elfish craftsmanship is extremely exquisite because of the long years the elves had to hone their craft, and because of the limited amount of elven craftsmen at any time, it might also be very rare. So therefore maybe elfish fashion trends, such as boob armor, would be seen as a sign of high status and wealth and good taste among the nobility. Or maybe, just like in many cultures in our world, a modestly dressed man or woman is basically someone which is covered head to toe in clothing. In a fantasy world, modesty and appropriate clothing could be exactly the opposite. For example, in a catgirl society it could be seen as a sign of insidiousness and distrust, because any cloak could harbor any dagger. So basically it's the idea of transparent backpacks taken to the societal level. Or maybe revealing armor is just the standard armor for all imperial troops, because now they are pleasant to look at. And since the Empire has conquered basically the entire continent, the most dangerous situation a military serviceman could find itself in is to not look absolutely stunning in micro bikinis while parading their oiled up bodies through the streets. Of course, such decadence is then seen as a sign of weakness by the bands of formerly independent tribesmen that are now united under a new charismatic leader that promises plunder and prestige to all of those who are willing to invade the Empire. Now my point basically is that fabric-saving clothing in general and boob armor in particular could, if properly explained and integrated into a fantasy world, be actually more than just an argument for why one should play Lord of Midriff 2, the big expansion pack, and be an actual statement about the culture, the state of society, and the very lens a civilization views reality through. Or it could just be fan service. Hello and welcome to another fantasy lore video, and today we are going to take a closer look at how realistic snow elves would potentially work. As usual, realistic means in the context of the world or in the world's lore. In the lore of a fantasy universe and its rules and regulations and its established magic system and the likes of it. Not strictly by our own laws of physics. And snow elves are literally the most rare and underrated fantasy elf species in my opinion, which is pretty sad, because they have so much potential, for one simple reason. If we see that wood elves are living in the wood, and they are commonly said or depicted to be either in tune with nature or at least have made a pact with it, then by this logic snow elves should be firmly integrated within snow and ice. And here's the beauty of this idea and concept. Why would an elf species, or really anything living, want to live in the Arctic circles? Well, for two reasons. Reason number one, safety from predators. Just like certain birds are breeding in the desert, near the Red Sea, simply because the heat kills off everything that could potentially threaten them. Snow elves might have migrated to the far north or far south of a fantasy world in order to find safety, maybe from humans, maybe from their more edgy dark elf cousins, or maybe because of dragons. But regardless of the reason, the snow elves could then sustain themselves just like how most of the big animals like polar bears or whales or various other mammals make their living in the Arctic Circle, by preying on krill. And the very fact that the blue whale, the biggest being on our entire planet, has adapted itself to kill krill, one of the smallest life forms in the entirety of the earth lives rent-free in my head thanks to Tirzu. But regardless whether or not the snow elves would farm algae or be the biggest whalers in this world's history, the snow elves would have to deal with the cold. And here's where the true potential of snow elves lie, in their potential for creating a truly distinct biology, because elves are very light, very slender, and rather devoid of fat reserves, so therefore they all should be extremely susceptible to cold and exposure. And here's the thing, what if snow elves, maybe by some magical evolution, or maybe just by a transformative ritual, have naturally cold blood, as in their blood is naturally very, very cool. Maybe to the point that a warm autumn's day would be enough to give them all a heat stroke, and maybe the blood can be cooled to -10 degrees Celsius without freezing, due to some natural antifreeze in their body or due to some magical means. Their entire biology could be very alien, and in turn they would die or literally melt in temperatures, let's say above 0 degrees. Even just 10 degrees positive could literally fry them, and therefore their entire species should be confined to the highest points of the northern and southern poles. Imagine a civilization that would build homes out of ice blocks instead of bricks, that would think about snow as soft and warm, that would fear the burning sun. The possibilities are endless, like the moon could be their sun, for example, and their long ears might still have the effect of giving up surplus heat, because even though they live in the Arctic Circle, -2 degrees Celsius is really hot for them. So they have to pass off the heat their bodies would still be generating due to movement and such things. Maybe that's why they are hibernating during the summer instead of the winter. Maybe that's why they only come out at night. And maybe that's why sailors, far adrift, talk about mysterious night elves that save them from certain death. Just like tales of daywalkers with fire bodies would circulate at the pole regions of these snow elven tribes. And these natural isolationists would be a very interesting thing from any Roman's point of view. I mean, you saw the pictures in this video, but even if the elves would take an interest in you, your body heat would literally fry them. Maybe a young magical apprentice now needs to find the same long-lost spell that once has transformed what would otherwise have been wood or high elves into these rather cool creatures. Again, this entire setting has so much potential. For example, rare, and I mean exceptionally rare half-elves could act as intermediaries between their more cold-blooded northern cousins and their more hot-blooded relatives down south. The potential is really endless, and that's why it's really sad that only the Falmer, the degenerate form of the snow elves, are basically the only type of snow elf that is even there in mainstream fantasy. Snow elves really represent such an alien concept for an elven civilization. But hello and welcome to another video about world building and about how realistic elves would work in the context that they are far longer lived than mere humans. And again, I personally think time is the main factor in how far removed the elves would be from our own human perspective. It all depends on their lifespan. An elf race that would live for 150 years, which is a fairly mild increase in lifespan compared to us humans, which is a fairly mild increase in lifespan as far as fantasy universes are concerned, would still be so vastly different to humans. Even short-sighted actions and policies would account for at least a decade or two, because the very same elves that are doing something will still be around to then suffer the consequences from it. Therefore, elf societies would still face something like the tragedy of the common or other related problems, but the time span it would take for such problems to be caused, to arise, and then to be painfully corrected or dealt with is far longer, and therefore elf societies would be far more stable and long-term thinking from our own human point of view, to the point where other humanoids with a far lower lifespan, for example humans, orcs or catgirls, could focus years on, for example, finding a profitable way to trade with elven society, without having to worry that a sudden change in taxes and tariffs will disrupt supply or demand from the elf side. This could even be a generational thing, where the father, the child and the grandchild will trade with the same elf. The by elf standards very minor increase of just 70 years to their lifespan when compared to humans would turn nearly every elf society into an anchor of stability, because once again the individual elves would all think in much longer time spans compared to us humans. And it will get really weird from our own human perspective if elves really do live for thousands of years. Imagine if elves would take 1000 years just to be an adult. That would be 1000 years of guarding and guiding an individual, but also 1000 years of learning and growing into a functioning member of society, with many decades of practice in even fairly uninteresting things. Just break this down to school. Imagine instead of studying math for 3 odd years, elves would study math for 300 years. The things they could do, learn and figure out even before they were fully grown adults would likely dwarf anything that we humans could achieve in our short lifespan. And with the time to accumulate so much knowledge, every elf would basically be a nearly all-knowing universal genius, able to draw the maps of the world out of memory down to the town districts and streets, simply because he studied them for 100 years. And then he will be very surprised when he learns that this town no longer exists. And again, if elves truly live for 5000 years, then they would think in these, to humans, near infinite times. From Rome to modernity, it was just 2000 years, so basically the first elves would now reach their adulthood, or their middle age, and not a single elf would have died from old age at this point. Imagine the perspective that they would have. Towns, nations, and entire empires would be compared to ant colonies or beehives to the elves with their vast lifespan. Yes, they take notice, but ultimately, even the longest standing human civilization would be seen as a very fast-paced, fleeting thing to the long-lived long ears. And if elf lives are truly that long, their entire behavior would be strange and incomprehensible to us humans, like entire elfin families or even cities preparing for decades of their life in order to live in the middle of nowhere in a dry and arid region. It would be seen as nothing but madness to us, to entire human generations. And remember, they are elves. They will do things hundreds and thousands of years ahead, and it would be even more incomprehensible to us humans that these towns and these cities that are now being built in the middle of nowhere are only held up by credits, by money, landed over 1000 years. To us humans it would be just nuts. But to the elf it would make perfect sense, because in just 100 years, a major river would have eroded its surrounding land enough that it would change its course by hundreds of miles, and ultimately it would end up flowing through the very desert that the elves are settling in, turning it into a rich green forest and beautiful meadows. And what growing grass or crops are to humans, growing oaks or olive trees would be to elves. So all these bizarre lined up settlements in the desert would be nothing but waterfront properties in a time span no single human could truly understand. And entire kingdoms, languages and civilizations would rise and fall before the simple act of moving to another home would have concluded, as far as the elves are concerned. And maybe the reason why elves are this beautiful, seemingly ageless paragon of goodness and justice is less benign. Maybe. And this would be a huge plot twist. There are no elves at all. Elves are a made-up species of hot, beautiful, talented, wise humans, so that eldritch horrors, who stalk the forests for eternity, could lull an entire nation in a false sense of safety until the stars are right to strike. So my point is that the longer the lifespan of an elf is, the more alien and incomprehensible would his thoughts, actions, and the entirety of his civilization be, and it alone could be a truly great plotline or premise for an entire setting. And with that said, I'm now interested in your thoughts and ideas. How much would a longer lifespan truly change the elves from a human point of view? And with that said, I hope you will join me next time in the next episode of Fantasy World Building. For today, this is it, and I say thank you very much for watching, and have a nice day.